Hello, this is Dr. Gwen Fisher in Psychology 440, Industrial Psychology, still talking about the criterion problem. And you may be wondering, when are we going to get around to talking about what the criterion problem really is? Well, that's our focus in Module 4.4. The objective of this module is for you to understand and explain what we mean by the criterion problem. And integrating with the prior material in this module, by the end of this, you should be able to explain how to choose good criteria. So what do we mean when we say the criterion problem? Historically, the criterion problem has been a big issue in industrial psychology. Austin and Villanova in 1992 published a review paper in the Journal of Applied Psychology, in which they reviewed the literature all the way back to 1917 and identified that this really is a critical issue. And although going into large detail about what's happened since 1992, we'll just say that it is still an issue. The key definition for what we mean by the criterion problem is that we have a lack of overlap between our conceptual criterion and the actual criterion. So think again about the Venn diagram in the previous module, in which we had a lack of overlap between the conceptual and the actual criterion. When we don't have that overlap, we end up with some measurement limitations where we aren't able to map our concepts and our measurement as well as we would like. This seems to happen much more when we're focusing on work outcomes than we're focusing on the predictor side of the regression equation. In selection, we'll be talking a lot about the predictor side, but in criteria and performance measurement, we're going to be talking about the outcomes. There have been a number of well-known industrial organizational psychologists who have written about the criterion problem. In a book by Bob Guyon, published in the late 90s, he indicated again that this is still an issue and said that much of the early research really stemmed from debates about criterion dimensionality. In other words, what are all the concepts that make up what we think of as the conceptual criterion and what should we choose for our measurement? Sometimes people would argue for using an overall criterion, whereas others would focus on specific aspects of performance. We'll be getting much more depth in the next module, in Module 5, when we talk about performance measurement. Another issue raised by Marv Dennett is that there's been too much of a focus on what's practical or what results in high levels of predictability without thinking critically about what really makes sense. In other words, researchers and IO psychologists have suggested that we need to focus much more on what our understanding is on the conceptual criterion and not just choose actual criteria because they're easy to obtain. Another thing to point out from a measurement standpoint is that we don't want a situation where the actual criterion measures overlap with each other. If you look at this diagram, what we have are multiple specific ways that we can assess job performance, like customer satisfaction, performance ratings, and number of units produced. And what we see by this overlap among the red circles is that they're highly correlated. And when the actual criteria are highly correlated with one another, what we lack is the ability to result in explaining the variability in the conceptual criterion. So in other words, we do not want too much redundancy in our outcome or our actual criterion measures because it hampers our ability to explain criteria or explain the variance in our conceptual criteria. So in the next topic, we're going to be talking about how to define performance. At this point, I'd also just like to remind you about the criteria for criteria that we discussed previously, and we'll have a few questions as a review for you. Thank you.